If I could have everyone's attention, let's get started for the first of our two afternoon sessions. Both of them are about regulatory design. The first session deals with regulatory standards, and the second one deals with the question of who should do the regulating. I'm very pleased for this panel to have three legal experts who have a terrific background to discuss this issue. Our first speaker will be Hannah Wiseman, teaches law at Florida State University. Hannah was, I believe, the first law professor out of the box to write extensively about hydrofracking and its environmental risks, and she's written a number of very insightful articles on the subject. She'll be followed by Chris Kulander, who teaches law at Texas Tech Law School. Chris was a geophysicist in an earlier life and then a lawyer, and has practiced extensively in oil and gas law in Texas, in addition to being an expert on hydrofracking regulation at the state level. And finally, Mark Brownstein, who's Vice President and Chief Counsel to the U.S. Climate and Energy Program of the Environmental Defense Fund. Mark also teaches here at Columbia at SEPA, and has been active for a number of years in various nonprofit capacities dealing with environmental and energy issues. So, Hannah, take it away. Oh, I should also remind people again to mark their questions down on cards and give them to the people at the outer aisles to be collected when you have them.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you to the Dean as well for having me. I appreciate having the opportunity to be at this conference. I have the somewhat boring presentation that I'll try to make exciting, because I'm just setting the stage for the discussion of the content of statutes and regulation in this area, and I'm setting the stage at the federal level, and I'd imagine that most of you already have heard of most of the federal approaches that I will discuss today. But I'll try to add some normative analysis, particularly near the end, regarding potential holes left by the federal regulatory scheme and the extent to which states are filling in those holes or not. And then Chris will follow, I believe, with more detailed description of the substance of state regulations. So I'll start out just by telling you a little bit about what the job of the federal government is in this area. There's an increasing role here of the federal government. As you'll see, the EPA is quite active in expanding certain of its regulation of oil and gas development and fracturing. Then I'll describe a little bit the substance of the statutes that do apply currently, how the federal government is going about applying those statutes. It's not always been through formal rulemaking. In some cases, there's been soft law, agency threats, and whatnot, which I'll talk a little bit about. And then finally, I'll discuss those gaps. So the role, I believe Governor Freudenthal would disagree with the size of my state bubble here, right? Because he suggested that cooperative federalism might involve more state power than he would like. But at least as I view cooperative federalism, from looking at it on the books and from looking at the state permitting role and the state role in sort of assessing violations under federal acts, I do view the states as very core actors in this area, because the states implement many of the federal environmental statutes that apply to oil and gas drilling and fracturing, including many states implementing the Safe Drinking Water Act, which applies to oil and gas waste disposal, Clean Water Act, and other programs. And then I want to just briefly bring up the regional governance of shale gas development, especially in this area. The Susquehanna River Basin Commission, the Delaware River Basin Commissions, I think will play a growing role. They're already playing an important role in governing withdrawals of water for hydraulic fracturing. And the Delaware River Basin Commission, as those in New York may know well, proposed more detailed regulations that would have affected water quality. So they would have required sort of erosion control plans for drilled and fractured well sites and other measures. Those were challenged by New York State, but New York State was found to lack standing at this point because the regional regulations had not been finalized. The federal government does have a role in those agencies. It has a federal representative, and there's been a question of whether these regional agencies, the water commissions, are in fact federal. Because they have this federal representative, they receive some money from the feds. So I think that will be an interesting jurisdictional question moving forward. So the primary role of the federal government here is to, there are several important statutes that apply. Most of them are implemented by the states through cooperative federalism, and then also it has this slight role within the regional commissions. Moving quickly to the substance of the regulations, I've highlighted in yellow the entity that I view as having more power with respect to particular impacts or alleged impacts that were introduced earlier today. I want to emphasize that I'm talking about all stages of the shale or tight sands oil and gas development process here. I actually view most of the risks as occurring at the conventional stages of well development that have happened for many years. So I like to address the entire life cycle of the well. It seems to me that the greatest change from a regulatory perspective that fracturing has caused is just the sheer scale, as has been mentioned earlier today. And I believe that higher well densities can, in some cases, actually lead to new risks. Depending on the density, location, and timing of this booming new activity, we may see new risks which, although already regulated, may require revisitation. But currently, here are the governments that I view as having more power over each of these impacts or alleged impacts. So groundwater contamination, earthquakes at the waste disposal stage. This is when produced water flowback is injected into what's called a Class 2 underground injection control well under the Safe Drinking Water Act. That is a federally regulated activity. Many states have primacy in implementing federal Safe Drinking Water Act standards, so states actually issue the permit for the underground injection control well into which waste is disposed of. But I'm going to give the feds more power here just because, they do write the ultimate regulations that the states implement. Then we have potential groundwater contamination at the drilling stage. It is well known that improperly cased wells at the drilling stage can leak methane, as has been known for a long time. The fracturing, as we've discussed, that's much more disputed whether pavilion or otherwise we really have any problem there. But at the drilling stage, this is squarely within the states. States regulate the casing of oil and gas wells, the strength of the steel tubing, the percentage of calcium chloride in the cement. That is entirely within the realm of the states. Then moving to surface water contamination. I've put this more in the federal realm because there are Clean Water Act standards here, stormwater standards for sedimentation, as well as preventing direct discharge of waste into surface water. Also, of course, the federal government has control over POTW, publicly owned treatment water plant permitting. The states do play an important role here, and that leads me to soil contamination and spills, which is often connected to surface water contamination. So states have a key role in spills of oil and gas and fracturing fluids as well as waste because the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which addresses waste handling, transport, and disposal, exempts most oil and gas exploration and production materials and waste. So the states have control of the handling of this stuff, and the spills can lead to both soil contamination and surface water contamination. Air quality, the states have historically had the most control, possibly minor source permitting. Federal government is moving in quickly, though, with these proposed standards for green completion. And then finally, surface disturbance and habitat fragmentation. There are state standards for restoration of sites, but my argument is that habitat fragmentation is largely unaddressed in a formal regulatory fashion. Okay, very quickly, let's talk about the substance of some of these regulations. Class 2 underground injection control permitting. These are the wells into which millions of gallons of oil and gas waste are disposed of. As I mentioned, states typically often have the role of permitting. So the federal government writes the standards such as the disposal well must be cased in a particular way to prevent leakage, and then the states that have primacy then issue the actual permit. The states are supposed to require that underground sources of water will not be endangered by the injection. Here, the green represents states that have primacy, so the majority of the states do. Pennsylvania and New York notably do not. There have been some issues with underground injection control wells. I want to emphasize that this particular issue, this well may not have accepted waste from any fractured wells. It was a disposal well that took waste from oil and gas operations in the Crittenden field in Texas. I have no proof that any of those oil and gas wells were in fact fractured. But just to give you an example of what can happen with a disposal well, this well leaked into an aquifer. This is a disposal well, not a fractured well. It leaked into Midland, Texas's Cenozoic Pecos alluvium aquifer, contaminating billions of gallons of water. And this is a bankruptcy suit because the UIC operator filed for bankruptcy, and there was argument about who should have priority in getting money, including money to clean up the aquifer. Moving quickly to possible methane contamination of underground sources of drinking water, especially at the drilling stage. Again, this is all state regulated. There is also no federal regulation of the actual injection of fracturing fluids underground because of an Energy Policy Act 2005 exemption, except for fracturing with diesel. The EPA is currently writing guidelines for fracturing wells with diesel. There are, of course, examples of some problems in this area. Again, this is not a fractured well. This was into the Oriskany Formation in Pennsylvania. Maybe the well is fractured. I have no proof of that. This is just an example of what can happen if a well is not properly cased under state casing standards. We have the well operator concluding a casing collar failure occurred, which resulted in the release of natural gas into the subsurface. The gas release resulted in sediment and gas migration into streams, groundwater wells, etc. Because I have 13 minutes, I'm just racing through this. Surface water, here we go. We've moved beyond groundwater contamination, now we're at the surface. There are Clean Water Act provisions here saying you got to get a NPDES, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. If you want to just discharge oil and gas waste into surface waters, they differ depending on whether you're in the east or west. In the east, you basically just can't do it. The NPDES standard is you can't discharge oil and gas produced water into the surface. That's my understanding, at least from reading the regulation. West, there are some grease content standards, so you can possibly discharge some produced waters. My understanding is this is not a very common practice. And then wastewater treatment plants. It was mentioned earlier that several treatment plants in Pennsylvania may not have been adequately treating waste. The EPA currently doesn't have guidelines for pre-treatment of waste going to wastewater treatment plants. It's working on writing those. That's oil and gas waste from shale gas wells. And it's been primarily using threats while it is in the process of writing pre-treatment standards for wastewater treatment plants that accept shale gas waste. These were threats. I call them threats. They were basically strongly worded letters from the regional EPA to then Secretary Crancer in Pennsylvania DEP, saying, we have indication that your publicly owned treatment works are not adequately treating waste from fractured oil and gas wells. And Pennsylvania eventually discouraged the use of those plants. The EPA is also conducting studies in this area, both of impacts on surface and groundwater. There's this large study that was encouraged by a House report. The EPA has issued a progress report. After this, there will be a draft report, then more comments, and then a final report. The report addresses water acquisition, chemical mixing, possible spills during that process, injection wells and whether they're going to leak into groundwater, possible spills of flowback and produced water, as well as problems with wastewater treatment plants. So this is really a life cycle study of the use of water in hydraulic fracturing and potential water quality problems. Again, this is a federal study. Who knows whether it will result in any regulation. Okay, that went much more quickly than I expected. States have core control over what I believe is one of the most important issues in this area, and that is surface spills. This is an example of New Mexico collecting hundreds of instances in which it thinks that surface pits have caused contamination of groundwater. The reason the state governments have control in this area is that there is a RCRA exemption, Resource Conservation Recovery Act, for oil and gas exploration. Very briefly, what are some other ways the federal government has been involved, or sort of industry involved at the federal level? There's a move toward possible uniform standards, voluntary standards. Stronger is a very important organization here. It goes around looking at different state regulations and seeing whether they're adequate in the oil and gas area. And then finally, Chris will talk about more about the FracFocus Chemical Disclosure Registry, which is a national voluntary effort. And I'll leave that to Chris. Thank you.
Hope that's a beer. Howdy, everybody. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I'm going to talk about common state regulations that you see out there when you're looking at how the states regulate fracking. And thanks for having me. I want to start off with the gee whiz picture here. We've got a couple of new cities thanks to production. If you look up at the top of the, what is that, your left-hand map there, of the United States, you'll see a big bright spot under the D. That's the Bakken. That's all the flaring. That other map is the southern part of Texas. In between the red lines is the Eagleford. You can see it from orbit. That's how much production's going on right now. Okay, state fracking regulation. First question you got to ask is, are you allowed to do it at all? And in 2 states you're not, and 1 province. So, you know, that's kind of simple. You just can't do it. But what I found going through a lot of the state by state, their regulations, there's common themes that come out of what they look at. First is how you get the water and use it. Second is well completion requirements. Third, disclosure of fracking fluid ingredients. And fourth is flowback water disposal requirements. All right. Now, fifth might be kind of local rules about, and sometimes these bleed to state or local, when you can develop, what roads you're on, that kind of stuff. Your state text dot or NY dot, I suppose, would run that up here, and they work with the local governments. Now, what you'll find a lot of times is that in states with production, long history of production, they have a separate oil and gas state agency which runs their production and oversight. And in Texas, that's the Railroad Commission. Okay, don't ask why we still call it the Railroad Commission. It's because the railroads had all the land, which had all the oil. So we still do it, and won't change the name. But up in the Northeast, where you have new production, you have a state agency, typically a Department of Environmental Protection or something of that, and then within that will be the oil and gas agency. So it's nested in there like a Rorschach doll or something. All right. Okay. So let's look at some of these examples here, and you'll see some pictures of some frac operations that I've taken in my travails as a professor. Now, I can't go through and tell you what every state is doing in every one of these areas. I just don't have enough time. But what I'd like to do is maybe just look at one state per. And an example here is where do you get your water and how do you use your water? In Texas, it's the Texas Commission of Environmental Quality, which runs the surface water, Texas surface water acquisition. Texas has a relatively complex scheme where the surface water is managed by the state and the groundwater is managed by your groundwater conservancy districts. What they've done recently, TCEQ, they've been fairly quiescent until the last couple of years about water use. But with the onset of significant drought down there, drought that you wouldn't understand up here, like it didn't rain for 9 months in parts of the state near where I live. That'd be unheard of up here, I would think. But they had to define drought and what that meant, an emergency shortage of water and what that meant. And then once they did that, it allowed them to say when they can curtail use. So we have a prior appropriation as far as the surface goes. We'll say, okay, anybody who has a water right junior to this time, you're cut off. You can't draw, you can't use your water permit. So once they define all these things, maximum period, how long it can go on, and whatnot. Now, when you go to the surface, when you go to the groundwater realm, it's the groundwater management districts in Texas. And they generally control, they cover almost all the states, or all the state, and it was accepted that the water code exempts oil and gas drilling from coverage by these groundwater management districts. So for drilling or exploration operations, you did not need a permit from the TCEQ to drill a water well, or it was exempted. Well, we're a fairly friendly state to the oil and gas industry. But with the onset of significant drought down there, we've parsed out fracking operations. So now we have this vector of control from the groundwater management district saying, yes, we can regulate or permit your use of the ground for drilling and exploration operations, but we can for fracking operations. And so they've just kind of assumed that in the last year. We have the legislature meets every other year down in Texas on odd years. It gets a little odd in Austin. And they're saying that there's a couple bills, and this looks like it'll pass, where they will expressly allow groundwater management districts to require, if they want, permitting for groundwater use. Now, it all really depends on your state's water control regime. Here in the east, everybody has a reasonable right to pull off the river, which I guess is a good thing since, like the Susquehanna, I read a report that on average a drop of water is pulled out and put back in like 3 or 4 times before it flows out down in La Havre, Maryland, into the Chesapeake Bay. So you really use a lot of it. Not so, it's still a bit different in Texas. This is a frac water pit. You might pour 1 or 2 of these down a well. Behind this goofy-looking guy that might be familiar to you, they might pour 1 or 2 of those down a well. Okay, completion requirements. Another one. We'll go to Ohio for this. A lot of times they want a well completion report. They do in Ohio, and you're getting this in most states now. In Ohio, they want the type and volume of the fluid used to stimulate the reservoir. When it broke down, you saw that picture of those guys looking at the monitors. They can monitor in real time when the fractures actually occur, pressure differences, or if there's been a breach in well integrity, they can see that pretty much as it happens. A lot of times you'll see states require that if they have a breach like that, they have to report it or make a log of it and maybe turn it in later. Other things they require in Ohio, which are important in other places, methods used for contaminant fluids recovered. How did you do that? Name of the fracking contractor in case they want to go after them, and other facts. What else? Texas has they've had problems where they've actually come out recently and said, we think these should be the best practices. And that's turned into kind of a regulatory quagmire that's still going on because, of course, they asked for comment, and I don't think there was anybody who didn't comment. I mean, there were thousands of these things pouring in. So the state agency is still rolling through that. So we're kind of, you can make them report it on a well completion, but telling them what to do seems to be a significant step farther. Now, the disclosure of fracking fluid ingredients. This captured a lot of the media attention recently, and I think it's attenuating now somewhat because we've gone to this in most states, starting with Wyoming and then Arkansas, but then Texas. We had fluid ingredient disclosure for that chemicals that make up the 1.5% of the fluid that's being poured down the well. At Texas, at the start of 2011, really didn't have any regulations on disclosure. And by the end of the year, they did. They moved very quickly on this. They latched onto this online form called FracFocus.org. What you do on that is you enter the water, volume of water used, and the chemical ingredients, basically. Now, trade secrets, how you mix it up, the secret things that the secret formula that you want to protect because other firms are trying to copy it so they can not spend the money on the research and design that you did. You can keep that as a trade secret, but non-disclosure in Texas and other states may be challenged by landowners or neighbors. All right, what a neighbor is exactly hasn't been enumerated or defined in statute. I'm sure we'll see that or in the regs. What that means is that a first responder has to have access to the information. So, FracFocus.org, it started in April 11th, 2011, so it's a fairly recent. Groundwater Protection Council and the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission put it together. Contains general information. You go to the site, you can state by state and kind of click and go to where their regs are on that cover fracking. Has an explanation of what the process is, but the big thing is it's a well-by-well list of the chemicals and the volume that's put down each particular well. And it kind of looks like this. I know you can't read this, but this is what a single well looks like. This is in Haskell County, Kansas, which I know you can't see, but you have the ingredients and the supplier and whatnot. Let me blow that up a little bit. Here's what FracFocus requires. Well information, so that's kind of where it's located or its individual API number. That's kind of like the social security number for that well, just for that well. The chemical trade name, the supplier, the purpose, because the trade name Plex Break 134, I don't know what that is. But you can go out to a glossary that says, oh, that's a breaker. What does a breaker do? And so on and so forth. And there's been some complaints by folks on the environmental side that say, you need to elaborate on what these are. A lot of common people don't quite know what that might mean. So we're moving towards what they call FracFocus 2.0, where you're allowed to scan. The software allows you to scan so that you can see how many wells in the area are using this particular chemical or something, as opposed to just having it on a well-by-well basis, which might not be so useful. Chemical abstract number, maximum ingredient concentration, and other things in there. This is a frac operation in Texas. I'm looking down from the top of the sand truck. Flowback water disposal requirements. What do you do when you get it back from the surface? How much you get back really varies. You might get up to 80% back. You might get down to 25 to 30% back in South Texas. I'll go to West Virginia. That's supposed to be mountaineer colors there, but the yellow kind of maybe shows up. I don't know. Operators of Class 2 wells, those are those oil and gas wells, the disposal wells for the waste, are required to permanently dispose of wastewater from fracking. All right. Now, this is kind of in contrast to what we see in Texas, where there's kind of some agitation at the legislative level to not have disposal be the first refuge of a scoundrel, maybe, but to have it be recycling. Because in West Virginia, they are blessed with more water than they have, particularly in South and West Texas. So in South and West Texas, we'd like to see recycling more than just taking that fluid and pumping it down, that used fracking fluid, and pumping it down a disposal well. Hopefully, that would make oil companies look more at recycling, or perhaps using brackish water. We call that livestock grade water out in West Texas, that's the fastest 13 minutes of your life. We're right here, right at the end. You'll have your hydrofracking reporting form you got to fill out with each one of the what you've done, the amount and location of the water that was used, amount injected, wells location, and so on and so forth. And then finally, this is the last slide. What would a model regulatory scheme look like? This is a good way to review what I just talked about. Control of acquisition, use of water. You'd maybe try to make that uniform across the states. Casing, tubing, and cementing requirements. Disclosure of your fracking fluid ingredients. The feds are now requiring that, or will be on the BLM lands. Flowback water disposal requirements. And these slides are available. Just email me, and I appreciate your attention.
Okay. So I was at a conference last night, and I was introduced by saying, first we're going to talk about lead, and then we're going to get to something really sexy, natural gas, which tells you something about the conferences I've been hanging out in lately. It is an interesting topic, and for the environmental community, it's definitely a mixed bag. There's no question that the change in the supply and price of natural gas has had profound impacts on how we think about energy options in the United States. And it is fair to say that the increase in supply and the decline in price has played a significant role in the recent displacement of coal that we've seen around the country. And I will tell you that's a fundamentally good thing. We could have a whole conference on coal, and it would be, quite eye-opening for those of you who are not familiar with it, just exactly how problematic coal is as a fuel. But that being said, right, there are significant risks associated with public health and the environment with unconventional oil and gas development. And as I've often said, just because coal is awful doesn't mean that natural gas gets to be terrible. And so we're here talking about the ways in which we try to assure ourselves that natural gas development will not be terrible. And of course, it starts with strong regulation and enforcement, and much of what you've heard about over the course of today so far has been really about the fact that at the end of the day, this is not about whether Fed or state or local regulation should be paramount. It's really about how that web of regulation works, because it has historically been a web of regulation that has governed oil and gas development in the United States, and it will remain that way, and I would argue it should remain that way. That being said, what you want to make sure is that the strands of the web are strong enough and that you're not missing key strands. And I think that that fundamentally is what this conversation and other conversations about regulation in the space are all about. And of course, you've heard a lot about the things that need to be done, and I won't repeat them for the sake of time. I will emphasize that we've done a lot of work in partnership with Southwestern Energy. You'll hear from them in a little bit around things like model regulatory framework for well construction. And we're pleased to see that in Ohio, for example, some of those principles have been picked up. They're currently now being picked up by Texas and some of the work that Texas is doing. And I highlight that because although there is plenty of room for improvement in the quality of state regulation, and some states do lag, we are seeing changes. And that is a result largely of community pressure, because at the end of the day, right, what ultimately matters here is not what I think from Environmental Defense Fund, right? It really matters what the local community thinks about whether or not production is being done safely in their communities. And so the most powerful agent of change that I've seen in this space has been the communities themselves speaking out in terms of what they want and what they need. I've noted that as the presentations have taken place, that one thing that has gotten a little bit of a short shrift, actually two things that have gotten a little bit of short shrift are, number one, air emissions. It's appropriate to focus on water quality, and I think that does get a lot of attention. But actually, when you talk about sort of the tangible impacts that gas development have been having on communities, I think air emissions are basically an underreported and underappreciated phenomena. And I'm not just talking about air emissions at the production site itself, where you can have methane and VOC and hazardous air pollutants as the gas comes up if it's not properly controlled. But I'm also talking about the air emissions associated with the gen sets that are used to compress the fluid to send it down there. And most importantly, the trucks that go back and forth, literally the hundreds of trucks that go in and day out. And finally, right, in those jurisdictions that still allow open pits to be used for the storage of flowback or produced water, right, the VOCs that are often entrained in that water that volatilize out into the atmosphere over time. And although I am no public health expert, and I will not pretend to be one, I think that some of the claims that one sees in communities about respiratory distress in and around production sites is related to, in some combination of the truck traffics and the VOCs volatilizing off these pits. And that is something that I think needs to be addressed as we go forward. But the other issue that tends to get short shrift, although I understand this morning that it was talked about a little bit, is the issue of fugitive methane emissions. Right? This is not a public health issue per se, and in fact, many local communities may not care about this so much. But from an environmental standpoint, this could be perhaps the most lasting and important of the issues that we face with unconventional gas development, and that is the question of fugitive or leaking methane emissions, right? Methane, the prime ingredient in natural gas, is a powerful greenhouse gas. We're used to saying it's about 23 times more powerful than carbon dioxide, and that's true after it being in the atmosphere for about 100 years. But actually, methane is much more potent a greenhouse gas early in its lifetime. And I would argue that the time value of greenhouse gas pollution is a critical issue in terms of managing both the rate and the severity of climate impacts. And so this is something that we cannot ignore. We actually are working with industry to do field studies of fugitive methane emissions, beginning with the well, through the gathering infrastructure that brings the gas to the processing plant itself, then to the interstate pipeline system, and ultimately into the pipeline system underneath the city streets that brings the gas to your homes and businesses. We're looking at each point in the supply chain to understand how much of this methane is lost at each point. So we first get some better understanding as to the magnitude of the problem, but then also to use that information to improve how we're managing to reduce these leaks. And I think the good news here is that whether you think the number is big or small, and there is plenty of debate about it because right now there's no real data, people are just estimating. So whether you think the number is big or small, the fact of the matter is that there are technologies and processes out there to reduce these emissions. We've seen some of that in our own work so far. And we know from conversations that we've had with folks in industry, and I'm not just talking about producers, I'm also talking about folks in the midstream and the downstream, that there are in fact strategies that can be done to reduce emissions. Some of this will ultimately depend on the development of cost-effective emissions monitoring technology that would allow you to have more consistent monitoring of systems and more rapid response when you detect an exceedance or a leak. And that is a priority for us at Environmental Defense Fund is working to bring those cost-effective monitoring technologies to market. 3 more points that I would like to make. First of all, for all the talk that has been had about regulation, let's not lose sight of the fact that words on a piece of paper don't mean much if there aren't the resources there to implement and enforce. This is a big issue because most states are under budget pressures, as is the federal government. And we would submit that one of the priorities as we move forward here is in particularly as states continue to refine their fee structures for things like royalties and taxes associated with gas production, that some of that revenue needs to come back into the system to make sure that these programs are well funded. Now, that's not just me as an environmentalist talking. You could read the National Petroleum Council report called Prudent Development that was released in 2011, and they too will talk about the fact that there is support in the industry for better funding for implementation and enforcement of programs. So I think that this is an area that we can come together on. Second point that I would like to make is, for all the talk about regulation and enforcement, it is incredibly important that we keep a focus also on strategies to improve the culture in the industry itself. Several weeks ago, Environmental Defense Fund and others announced the initiation of something called the Center for Sustainable Shale Development, based in Pittsburgh. And what this organization is it is an organization that has established 15 performance standards for production of unconventional oil and gas, and a process by which producers can certify to those standards and be audited against those standards. Now, let me tell you, 15 standards is not a comprehensive list of everything that one needs to do to be a safe producer of natural gas, but these 15 standards were intended to focus on some of the most critical issues that are happening in the Marcellus region. Second, these standards are not, and the whole process of the CSSD is not a substitute for regulation, it's a complement to it. And here the analogy is the nuclear industry, where the nuclear industry after 3 Mile Island got together and formed the Institute of Nuclear Power Operators on the theory that the worst nuclear operator set the tone for the entire industry and that needed to change. And INPO, as it's called, developed a series of what were known as leading practices for managing both operations and safety at nuclear units and began to audit all nuclear operators against those standards. And I would submit to you, having come out of the utility industry, that this has been one of the important changes in the industry that has actually worked to make performance in the U.S. nuclear industry among the best in the world. It's not a substitute for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but it's an important complement to changing the culture of operation in that industry, and I would submit to you that this can and should be done in the gas industry as well. It needs to be. Because again, you're talking about hundreds of wells over thousands of miles, and environmental protection for any specific community rests on what any one crew decides to do on a day-in, day-out basis. The number one source of water contamination associated with oil and gas production today are truck accidents. Okay? This is not high-tech stuff, but it talks about the management culture and the incentives that employees have to do their job properly. And it's no easy thing, but part of it is work culture. And then finally, right, I believe that much of the anxiety that you're seeing in the environmental community as it relates to gas production has nothing to do with production itself, or even necessarily with fugitive methane emissions, as important as that is. But what is the energy future of the United States? So I started my talk by saying that this change in gas production has yielded some important near-term environmental benefits in terms of helping us to displace coal. And that's true. But natural gas is not a long-term solution to our energy future, given how much we need to do to get to a low-carbon future. Right? And so while we're developing this gas now and working to make sure that its development is as safe as possible, understanding that this is an industrial process and no industrial process is 100% risk-free, we need to also be focused on those strategies that help bring the next set of technologies into our energy mix, renewables, energy efficiency, and the like. I take comfort in the fact that last year, when natural gas was at a 20-year low in terms of price, was also the year of the greatest amount of wind deployment in U.S. history. So the simple fact of cheap gas is no obstacle to continued development of renewable resources. But the challenge is to make sure that we do not lose focus on maintaining the policies that have gotten us to this point on renewable energy, and that we not only continue those policies, we double down on them. Thank you.
So we have about 17 minutes for questions, and I have a few good ones here, but if you have questions, please give them to the people on the side. I'm going to start with a question for Hannah, just so you listen to the question, because you've written on this, I think. So the question is, numerous panelists have mentioned the scale of fracking as being unprecedented. In light of the scale, how important is the proper level of enforcement? Has any state adequately enforced existing laws? If so, what states would be models of adequate enforcement of existing laws? So you've written about cumulative impacts, and this might be a version of that.
Sure.
Question.
Thanks. So I call this diseconomies of scale in my latest paper, and the argument is that just looking at the long-known conventional impacts of oil and gas development, the fact that hydraulic fracturing has enabled wells in some states to increase by 300% in 1 year, that happened in Pennsylvania between 2008 and 2009, just that fact alone, the expansion in scale can cause new risks because of cumulative as well as interactive effects. The density of wells, the timing at which they are drilled and fractured matters a lot. So if you're fracturing 50 wells in one day in a particular area of Pennsylvania and everyone's trying to withdraw from the same river during a drought, all of those conditions can come together and cause a potential risk. And this does raise the enforcement question, certainly, because when you increase well numbers by 300%, you typically don't increase the number of field inspectors by that amount, simply due to budgetary limits. But some states are taking relatively aggressive measures to enforce more. I'd say Pennsylvania is doing a good job of slightly expanding the numbers of inspectors, but also just reporting the notations of violations of state oil and gas regulations. And that's very important so the public can know what the inspectors are finding. So you can go to Pennsylvania and download a comprehensive Excel database of all the violations. And that's very unusual. Most states do not comprehensively report online those types of issues. West Virginia's legislature has been surprisingly progressive on this as well, implemented a $10,000 per horizontal well permitting fee. I'm not sure if that has been actually used in West Virginia yet, but the legislature also suggested that field inspectors must have minimum qualifications, energy, environmental experience, and receive minimum salaries, $35,000 for an inspector, $40,000 for a supervisor. So I think efforts like that are encouraging, and other states like Colorado have doubled most of their penalties in oil and gas. All of these efforts can help to fund the expanded enforcement efforts that are necessary as scale expands.
Okay, this question I will answer myself, but then, excuse me. This question I'll answer myself, but I'll invite the other panelists to weigh in. What role has private and public litigation played in forming the current regulatory scheme for fracking, or are the primary rulemakers legislatures and regulators? My own impression, at least, is that public and private litigation has played virtually no role in the development of the regulatory scheme. Arguably, the 11th Circuit case on the Safe Drinking Water Act played a role in stimulating Congress to exempt fracking from the Safe Drinking Water Act, but I don't see any other evidence to date of litigation having a formative influence, but maybe the other panelists have different impressions about this.
I think litigation helped steer the formulation of some surface damage acts, which is where the mineral developer goes in and negotiates or at least notifies the surface owner of what's going to happen and when it's going to happen and if he's going to pay any damages as might be required by state law. That might bleed over, I think, a little bit into some of the regulations, such as how your pit liners, those kind of things, that would affect all production, including hydro, secondary or enhanced recovery due to fracking.
Just briefly at the federal level, Tom, you also mentioned in your paper the stormwater permitting, which Congress tried to exempt oil and gas, essentially exempt oil and gas sites from stormwater permitting under the Clean Water Act. But the suit by the Natural Resources Defense Council, I think largely, I don't know if they gutted that exemption, but oil and gas sites are now subject to stormwater permitting, largely due to that NRDC case, as well as the Earth Justice petitions for TSCA disclosure, which maybe will be mentioned later. Disclosure of chemicals at the federal level under TSCA.
But I would agree that not much has been carried over.
I'm going to throw this one to Mark. What, if anything, is different about rogue methane emissions from fractured unconventional versus conventional gas wells? Similarly, are there any differences with respect to, I think it says, midstream and long-haul pipeline businesses?
No, once you get to, so first of all, once you get past, essentially, once you get to the gathering infrastructure, the issues are common. So I think that one of the things one of the reasons, though, why this issue is coming up now, of course, is the greater volume of gas that's being produced, and the need to build new infrastructure to accommodate that. and the new uses for natural gas that people are talking about, whether it's in transportation or in generation or like here in New York City, quite appropriately supplanting number 6 fuel oil with gas and other lower polluting fuels. I think the issue itself with unconventional may have something to do with the produced water that's coming up along with the gas and the need to make sure that there's separation technology there. But that could be in both cases, conventional and unconventional. A lot of what we're seeing in terms of methane pollution now is the concerns that you're seeing with, say, the flaring that's going on in the Eagle Ford and the Bakken, where you've got a lot of associated gas. You're going after the oil because that's what's most profitable, and there isn't really the gathering infrastructure in place yet to bring that gas, that associated gas, to market. And so right now it's either being vented or it's being flared. If it's being flared, the question is how effective is the combustion efficiency of those flares? How well are those flares maintained even when they have high combustion efficiency? And in certain cases, as I said, for example, in the this was going on in the Barnett, where companies were intentionally not flaring it because the local communities found the flares more discomforting than the idea that methane was being vented. And since you couldn't see it or smell it, it was better to just vent it. The recent EPA New Source Performance Standard for oil and gas will address some of that, but in fields where it's associated gas, arguably they're still allowed to do that.
Okay, I'm going to give this question, I think, to Chris. To what extent should gas companies be permitted to require complainants' victims to sign agreements, settlements that are contingent on their keeping quiet about the problems that led to the complaint? Isn't this a violation of public policy?
Well, I think it sounds like it would be. I think money makes a lot of things go away, so if there was maybe a check that was stapled to the back of such an agreement, realistically, that's a lot of what, say, a Surface Damage Act is. It's we pay you for this or that happens. If this happens, we pay you this, and if that happens, we pay you that. That doesn't to strong arm somebody into saying, well, we'll stop development, if you complain or something like that. That doesn't sound like a very good methodology.
This question is for Hannah. Do you believe federal Superfund laws apply, or the Superfund law applies to surface spills of fracturing fluids and wastewater?
Thank you for asking me all of this. Questions for the slides I didn't have time to get to. Yes, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act definitely applies to surface spills of fracturing fluids as well as fracturing and oil and gas wastes. The only substances at oil and gas sites that are exempt expressly from CERCLA are petroleum resources themselves. Pure oil and gas. And Professor Gerard brought up earlier, potentially, even if that oil or gas were mixed with flowback and or other substances, that could also be subject to CERCLA because of the mixing rule, right? You can't mix a hazardous substance with something that's exempt in order to get out of RCRA or CERCLA. So I do believe that CERCLA is perhaps the most ignored statute in the oil and gas industry. I'm concerned that some operators aren't thinking about it. There haven't been massive spills. We don't have any Superfund sites, I believe, caused by oil and gas recently. But I think it is something that operators should at least keep in mind, be knowledgeable that down the road they may be liable for a large cleanup cost if in the event of an unusual spill.
I don't know who's going to take this one, but it's a good question. Is there any progress on reducing the toxic chemicals used in fracking? And then there's a little calculation done here. 4 million gallons of water per frac times 0.001 chemicals equals 4,000 gallons of chemicals per one frac.
Yeah, it's that old argument that you'll hear from folks who are opposed to developments, where if this glass is 1% cyanide, it'll still kill you dead. I think that you're seeing a lot of first you saw the eliminate diesel was the first big imbroglio that broke out over whether or not you should use this, or this could contain carcinogens, turn into benzene or something like that. And by and large, they've done and they had an agreement to not do it with coal bed methane, but then they kept doing it with shale. It seems to be going away. When one particular chemical seems to be targeted, the industry seems pretty good at getting rid of it. But to some extent, it's like putting your finger down on mercury. I know there's other types of fracking that use a lot less water, like gel-based. Propane is used in Texas, primarily I hear, CO2 slurries and other things like that. So I think as particular ingredients are identified as being problematic, substitutes will be found for them.
Look, here's the deal too, right? I mean, if your well casing is good, okay, if your wastewater management system is good, if your waste disposal system is good, right, none of this stuff should be finding its way into groundwater in the first instance, right? That being said, green chemistry is a good thing to do, right? Trying to detoxify the chemicals that are used in the frac process is important, but what I often remind people is you know, when companies talk about food grade ingredients, right, salt is a food grade ingredient, and yet you wouldn't want a lot of salt in your drinking water, right? So just because you're moving to less toxic substances doesn't change the nature of what you need to do to isolate the fluids from groundwater. You know, that's the important thing to keep in mind.
One company, I forget if it's Chesapeake, has a green frac solution with lower toxicity. I think the hardest substance to make less toxic are the biocides necessary to clean out the shale. I'm not sure if I've heard that. And then one state to look at that's interesting, Idaho has discouraged use of benzene, toluene, ethylene, xylene, BTEX in fracturing. So Idaho is one of the few states that's actually addressed the fracturing process itself and discouraged certain chemicals.
Here's a question for you. How much fracking does Idaho have? I don't.
Okay, fine.
I think there's some over near in Washington County, but there's
Easier.
yeah.
It's like Vermont, which has banned fracking. Very bold move on their part. There's some kind of a video or something, I haven't seen it, but it's referenced in our paper of Halliburton executive drinking fracking fluid to prove that it's safe.
Actually, I was at the conference where the CEO got up with the fluid, but then had his CFO drink it. It was like something out of The Simpsons, you know, Smithers.
Question, I don't know again who to take this, but somebody would like to elaborate a bit on exactly what are the health risks from fracturing, both short-term and long-term. Do we know much of anything about what kind of health risks could result from exposure to these chemicals?
I don't know much about that. I mean, some of these they're said to be carcinogens. I guess if that's
So here's the challenge, right? Here's the challenge, right? Define health risks.
I just read the questions.
No. No, and it's an important question. I don't mean to be flip about it, okay? But you know, there are a variety of challenges, right, associated with this. Some of them are ones that are, well, like we were just talking about, right? We know that if you get benzene into water, there are health problems associated with that. In fact, we know if we get too much salt into water, there are health problems associated with that, okay? And we have a long history of environmental regulation in an effort to try to minimize those types of events. What this process, though, challenges us with a little bit is, as we talked about, the intensity of the development, which has impacts on things like air quality, not because any one well necessarily is exceeding any health standard, but because the cumulative impact of a lot of wells may contribute to, as we've seen out in Wyoming, exceedances of the federal health standard for ground level ozone. And also because, you know, frankly, intensity of development in a suburban or rural area changes the character of the area, and that in turn creates stresses on communities that have secondary effects. So it may not be the pollution that's problematic, but it may be the stresses that are created in the community that create public health impacts. And I think that's part of the debate that you've been seeing in New York, is how best to define what is the universe of health impacts that is appropriate to study or to monitor, and how are you going to do that? One of the things that I would have added in my comments, if I had a little more time, so I'll do it now, is I do think that it is useful for states like New York, okay, to baseline public health metrics now, okay, and then put in place efforts to monitor any changes in those metrics over time if and when development is allowed to go forward. And in that way, you've done two things. One is you've created some kind of measures to be able to assess what impact, if any, development is having on communities. And you're also gathering information that may help you to revise your regulatory regime if you find that there are changes that are of note. You know, one of the things that's really troubling about this is you can go to a site and ask a site manager if production there is safe, and he will tell you yes. And yet if you ask him for the air emission data that's been collected at that site, he will tell you there is none. Just like he will tell you in most cases that there is no data assaying the chemicals or the substances that are in the water in that holding pond. And so if and when the truck taking that water away overturns on County Road 523, okay, the county health official can't be assured of what was in the water that just got into the stream as a result of that spill. And so there's work to be done here to make sure, above all else, that there's information available about what is being produced, what's being emitted into the air, what's being transported from A to B, and in that way you could do a much smarter job of not only regulating, but also give people information that actually reassure them that although it may look nasty, it's actually not all that bad.
That said, there hasn't been a lot of litigation that's gone successfully forward against this. There's just not a lot of data.
Can I squeeze in one more question, because I think it's one that's probably on the minds of a lot of people that are reading about this, and we need to have very brief answers. How can you be 100% certain that there will be no long-term effects on, it says water tables, I think they mean water supplies and water aquifers caused by fracturing?
Yeah, we can't be. I mean, this is why Texas is studying, the Trinity Aquifer and others, because even though it's only 1% or less of total water consumed or used in the state, I think there's still concerns, especially at the local level, of over-withdrawal too quickly, too much.
100% is something I don't think you can ever guarantee 100%. You could never guarantee that there's not an old well out there that could be a conduit for, even if you had a perfect casing set, there might be an old well out there that could be a conduit. That'd be a very rare circumstance, but, that knocks you down from 100% right there.
I'm not 100% certain of anything.
With that, the panel is adjourned. We'll take a brief break and be back at 2:30.